Okay, I'm sure we will have more people joining us, but for now, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. We are in the final stretch this semester, so by this time, if we still remember our names, we are lucky, right? So thank you so much for coming today and, to spend this hour talking about art, which is the best thing in the world, after all. Before we start, I want to acknowledge some people in the audience. Chris Nelson is here, and I'm thrilled that she could join us because she was instrumental in helping Roberta with the first exhibitions. Right? She designed many early posters and so forth. So it's very cool that she joined us. Thank you so much to my beautiful assistant, Emma Dennison, who was relentless in reminding me about all these forms that I needed to fill. We have Michael Katz, who taught multiple studio courses here. Of course, we have our residential, internationally renowned poet, Terry Wittek, who always went to Roberta's lectures and is a great supporter of the arts. We have James Pearson, the director of the Hand Art Center. Hi, James. And now we are moving to the star of the show, Dr. Roberta Favis, who will talk about her experience curating Bluemner exhibitions, and she curated more than 20 exhibitions at Stetson and elsewhere, becoming a notable Bluemner expert in the process. So, Roberta, you can take it away.
Okay, well, let's see, can I share the screen? Here we go. Technical stuff. Okay. Oh, okay, keep, no, that's not what I wanted it to do. Sorry. There we go. I think I've got it to slideshow, haven't I? But I want it back at the beginning. Sorry. I'm sure there's a quicker way of doing this, but I seem to be doing it the slow way. There we go. This is going to be a little bit of deja vu all over again for a lot of you, and maybe for some of you, because I guess a lot of you are invisible to me. It will be some brand new stuff, because since the access to the Hand Center this year, even when there were Bluemner exhibits, has been rather limited. Maybe that not that many of you have actually gotten to be in there. So the story of Bluemner and Stetson started off back in 1990. Well, actually, it was earlier than 1994. I think it was 1993. And it started off with this woman, Vera Bluemner Kuba, who was the daughter of the artist, and with a meeting that took place between one of the women in development who talked to Gary Boulding, who was then director of our little gallery, which was over in Sampson Hall, in what I guess now is that still a senior art studio, or is it something else these days? Whatever. Anyway, that room on the right when you go into Sampson Hall. Gary and Linda Davis went over to meet with Vera Kuba in her house in DeLand, because she had expressed an interest in leaving a collection of her father's artwork to Stetson. And Gary went over there and was totally blown away, and had done his homework and looked up and to see that this was indeed a significant artist and not just somebody's favorite father with, lots of pictures in his closet. And anyway, eventually she decided that indeed she wanted to leave the collection to Stetson, because of the fact that she had often come over to the Stetson campus to listen to concerts and things like that. And so she when her husband was still living, she had no direct heirs, and she wanted to make sure that the work would be taken care of and that somebody would use it to bring attention to the importance of her father's career. That little sketch is a picture of her when she was 7 years old, back in 1910. And the photograph was taken when Gary and I put together what was to be the very first Bluemner show at Stetson. There, you can see one of the pictures on the behind her. That exhibit was in those little glass cases that are still in the hallway in Sanson Hall, and was I think there were maybe 9 or 10 pictures that we went and borrowed and reframed because they'd been in horrible frames before, and so we said they needed to match, and we put that exhibit up. Now, one of the things that we discovered, of course, is that she had a few things hanging on her walls, and we increasingly discovered that she had more and more and more and more things in all kinds of places. Of course, none of them came conveniently labeled and identified. So that was part of our first job. But for those of you who are not familiar, let me tell you just a quick bit about Oscar Bluemner, and I'm not going to read through all of this, but his dates, 1867, just think about right after the end of the American Civil War, and to 1938, right before the beginning of the Second World War, just put you into a context of American history. He was born in what was then Prussia, now Germany, and actually, after moving around quite a bit with his father, who was a kind of a master builder in Germany, went eventually to train as an architect. And even though he had had some success already as a student, he got a nice gold medal, which Stetson now owns, for his achievements. He decided in 1892 that he was going to emigrate to America. That was a time when a lot of people were doing that. In fact, he was probably came in through Ellis Island, one of the first group of immigrants to come through Ellis Island into the United States. And for the next 2 decades, he worked off and on in various capacities as an architect. He moved back and forth between Chicago and New York. He spent a little time in New England. And all of that time, he was also making artwork, making paintings of various kinds, drawings and watercolors particularly. He became an American citizen in 1899. His 2 children were born. And by the early part of the 20th century, he was living in New York, and he met up with Alfred Stieglitz, who was renowned as a photographer, but who also was extremely important figure in America as a gallerist. And partly through his contacts with Stieglitz, and also through the facts that he'd been educating himself about new styles and possibilities in art, he decided by 1911 that he was too frustrated with his career in architecture and that he wanted to totally concentrate on painting. He was helped in doing that by the fact that he actually won a lawsuit against a man who had hired him to help with his design, and in fact to design the Bronx Borough Courthouse, and then had tried to cheat him out of all the recognition and all the money that he had promised him. Eventually, Oscar Bluemner won the lawsuit, decided that he was going to then really switch from architecture to painting, was able to make a 7-month trip back to Europe, leave some money for his family at home, and go to visit both places that he had grown up in Germany, and also to travel around to down to in France, in Italy, and finally to England. 1912, if any of you have studied the history of modernism in the 20th century, you'll know that it was the year that all the isms were happening in Europe and just beginning to appear. German Expressionism, Cubism, Orphism, you name the ism, and it was there. And he saw it all, and he took notes on it all. And he also visited practically every museum that he could possibly get access to. And then he came back to the United States and began to, he had exhibited his own first works in Germany in 1912 during his trip. He came back and exhibited in what were to be very important venues for that period, in the Armory Show, which was a big big deal of exposing Americans to what was going on in modern art in Europe. He had a solo exhibition at Stieglitz's gallery that they called 291. He was in another exhibit called the Forum exhibition. And basically, during this time, he's also not only going from being an architect to being a painter, but he's also going from being a very traditional painter to being a very modernist painter. If you look at these pictures, and all the pictures by Bluemner that I'll show you are from Stetson's collection. In the end, we found that Vera had tucked away in portfolios and envelopes and under the dresser and under the sofa, over 1,000 pieces that were part of her bequest. This little work of 1884 was from the days when Bluemner was a young teenager in Germany. This piece from 1909 shows him beginning to explore newer kinds of stylistic directions. Many of you might recognize the connection to Impressionism, for instance. But by the time he came back from Germany, he'd taken a radical turn to being something much more modernist. So that you see works that have new kinds of stylistic characteristics. He continues to work as an artist. In 1916, he moved his family from New York to New Jersey, and he began to explore other kinds of directions. He had some good critical reception, but he was constantly struggling to actually make a living and to be able to support his family, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times they were really just living on the edge of poverty. The fact that he was a German at the time when the Americans were just getting involved in World War I did not help very much because they thought he was seen as the enemy. He was even accused of being a spy at one point. And in 1926, by 16, he moved to New Jersey and lived in the suburbs. His wife died in 1926, and he then moved up to Massachusetts to live near his son. He had one more exhibition with Stieglitz at the Intimate Gallery. He was in the first biennial that was held at the Whitney Museum of American Art. But in the early 30s, he still had to rely on the public works of art project set up by Roosevelt to be able to feed his family. He had his last big major exhibition in 35. He was so excited about it that he walked out in front of a bus, was injured, ended up hospitalized, and his health after that continued to go downhill. 1938, he committed suicide. And so that was his brief overview. You can see the kinds of things in these works that really characterized, are considered very distinctive of his style. These bold new geometric forms, this very kind of compressed and flattened space. And most of all, I think most strikingly of all, the very expressive colors, especially those reds that earned him the nickname, the Vermillionaire. And you can also notice the subject matter. The subject matter here, this is a silk mill in Paterson, New Jersey. Actually, these are all Paterson, New Jersey. This is kind of the other side of the tracks in Paterson, New Jersey, an area where a lot of the people that worked in the silk mills lived. This is a view along one of the old canals in Paterson. They're not glamorous subjects. Paterson never was, I think, a really glamorous town. It was a manufacturing town. They're not the kind of subjects that a lot of the other modernists that work with Stieglitz became famous for, representing either really wild wilderness scenes or else representing skyscrapers and things that were extremely urban. He kind of picked the really kind of grotty in-between landscape, but he saw that as the landscape of the common man. His subject matter remains consistent throughout his career. And one of the things that you'll notice in them is that, one, you don't ever see people, or hardly ever see people, but he expresses the human through his particular motifs. They're almost always buildings. Remember, he started off as an architect, and there is usually some kind of a natural environment. In fact, by the time you get into the 20s and 30s, there's usually this kind of counterpoint between trees and buildings, in which also psychologically he saw the trees as being sort of the feminine inhabitants of his landscapes, and the buildings as being the more masculine. And he really kind of draws on both his kind of romantic feeling for nature, along with that very precise and mathematical mind of the architect. His final works, the ones that he showed in that very last exhibition, really sort of reduce and reduce and reduce those elements till you get the kind of something that's almost like a little distillation of that analogy between art and nature. And by this time particularly, he's very interested in the relationship between art and music, feeling that the visual arts ought to be able to really affect the feelings of the viewer in the same way that music does, without being specific or explicit in what they're saying, but simply by affecting the moods and emotions. So back to what the history at Stetson. The second exhibition we had at Stetson was a year when painter Steve Imany was there as a visiting professor and was also running the gallery. And he and I put together a small exhibition, again, in those cases, from actually it was an envelope of about 167 early color pencil sketches that Bluemner had done. Really very beautiful, very much prized and sought after today. And we picked out just a few to show in the cases in the hallway. So this was our second exhibition. And then in a couple of years after that, Vera Kuba herself passed away. And from the time that she died, although she had left her collection and indeed her entire estate to Stetson University, it took about more than three more years for that to finally get sorted out and finalized so that we could begin to assess what we really had. Gary and I had gone over to her house with the representative from Stetson, and literally had pulled portfolios out from under the sofa and envelopes full of drawings out of dresser drawers and things like that. And everything was stored in what was our then art vault, which was basically a glorified storage closet off one of the art studios, while we waited for them to finalize the business of the estate. Finally, in 2000, a representative from Christie's auction house came down, and the way that we did the appraisal of the estate was that we set up a bunch of tables in what was then the gallery. We propped up all the things that were in frames against the wall. We identified the stacks of things as table A, table B, table C, and that was our earliest cataloging system for the entire collection. I later spoke with the woman who had come down to do the assessment, and she said it was actually the most complicated appraisal that she had ever had to do because it was so much work by a single artist. And in fact, she made every effort to set the overall appraisal of the entire bequest as low as she possibly could, because she didn't, because from whatever was going to be the appraisal, a certain percentage would have to go both to the lawyer and to the personal representative. And also she appraised it as if, if we were to sell everything instantly and flood the market one day, that might be the approximate value. So the approximate value at that time, I think she came up with was for the entire collection, something like $2.6 million. So then we had a great piles of work with very little information about it, no system of organization whatsoever. So for the following decade, our biggest project was simply to catalog things, to put accession numbers on them. And this was something that I did with the help of lots of wonderful Stetson students, mostly working on it. We photographed things, we put them in some kind of order, and lots of help from Chris. And eventually we began to make sense of what we had. And even before we had really gotten all that far in that process, the word was beginning to leak out that Stetson was the place that had all this incredible work by Bluemner. So that as early as 2000 and 2001, already we had a graduate student from the Sorbonne who was studying the work of Oscar Bluemner, coming to the campus to do research to support her dissertation. And then from Stetson, the first publication on the work was an article that I wrote on this particular, you'll maybe recognize a detail, a work called Jersey Silk Mills, that depicted the silk mills in Paterson, New Jersey. I was really interested in the fact that this subject was one painted by Bluemner at the time when the silk mills of Paterson, New Jersey were at the center of a big cultural conflict around a strike that went on there that brought in a lot of big cultural players. And eventually that article was published in American Art, and they picked our picture for the cover, which looked very nice, and also brought attention to Stetson and to the collection. But I knew that we were not going to get, out of that closet in the Sampson Hall without making making both the Stetson administration and the wide world out there much more aware of what we had. So we decided that somehow or other we were going to have a big exhibition from the work, even though we had to kind of make up the way of doing it. And we did it in that old gallery. Somehow we managed to squeeze 96 pieces into the gallery by borrowing portable walls from the museum across the hall, doing all kinds of things, and also to produce and publish a catalog of the collection, which we sent out strategically to people that needed to be made aware of it and pay attention. And so we held that first exhibition, which we Oscar Bluemner, A Daughter's Legacy, in 2004. And then already attention was drawn to it by the fact that the Luther Brady Gallery at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Asked to borrow at least a portion of that exhibition for an exhibit in Washington, D.C., where it got a little more attention than it did in DeLand. In fact, the attention had already been drawn to other places, as we'll see. And in conjunction with that, we held our first lecture series so that people would be made more aware of what was going to be known. So we brought back Adeline Julia, the student who had just completed her dissertation on Bluemner. We brought in Jeffrey Hayes, who had up to that had really been the major scholar working on Bluemner and had curated a number of important exhibitions of his work. We brought in Dr. Barbara Buehler-Lyons from the George O'Keeffe Museum here in New Mexico, and really tried to get the whole area aware of what was going on. And while we were still putting up the exhibit, we were already getting calls from the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, wanting to know when they could come down and see the exhibit, because they were planning a big major Bluemner exhibition that would run from 2005 into the early part of 2006. And they wanted to tap into our wisdom and what was to be learned, not only from the artworks, but also to various archival material that Stetson inherited. And so we also had to figure out how to loan works, which was also a new invention. But we figured it out somehow, and we sent, I think, 7 pieces up to the big exhibition at the Whitney, and also some more works to another exhibition that was held concurrently at Barbara Mathis Gallery in New York City. And then with all these things in our back pocket, the administration was increasingly interested in our idea, lobbying for having a better place than that closet to store the Bluemners, where they would be, safer, climatically controlled, et cetera, and also eventually having some kind of at least a small gallery where we could show some of the works on a more regular basis without sticking them all up there and just leaving them on the walls. And the first step in that was to get to have an assessment of the facility we did have, which was the old gallery, the Duncan Gallery in Sampson Hall, and our storage closet, basically. So we brought in a couple of people. We had an architectural reviewer who came in and reviewed, all of the specifics of the space. In order to do this, we had to first apply for a grant, which we got from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which was called a conservation assessment grant. And we brought in Walter Newman, who is here in this wonderful, Chris remembers this. This is a movie put together by Chris of Walter Newman and I looking at some of the Bluemners. Walter Newman was a conservator from the Northeast Document Center up in Massachusetts, one of the premier paper conservation places anywhere. And he came down and we were able to come up with some funds to have him just add on to his assessment of the facility, which was being paid for by the grant. To also just give us some ideas of some of the works that were most in need of conservation and how much that might cost us so that we could ask somebody to give us that money, basically. So then our next step was to try to figure out what next? Where are we going to put all this stuff? How are we going to take care of it? And with the result of this, the document that the IMLS grant gave us, we began to think about the possibilities, hoping for some space somewhere on campus. And suddenly, again, somebody from development called. It was the year that President Dolly was about to retire, and lots of people wanted to do nice things for Stetson that year, including Homer and Dolly Hand, who really wanted to build a building for something nice at Stetson. And thought that the idea of having a building that would house the Bluemner collection would make it, especially if we put it right on the quad there, would be a really nice way of honoring Dolly and, honoring Bluemner. So after their lead gift, we went with more ammunition to the Volusia County ECHO grant, and we're successful in getting additional monies from them. And lo and behold, thence evolved the Hand Center. We got another grant from the Institute of Museum and the National Endowment for the Humanities, rather, for equipment in the vault, shelves and the proper kinds of just boxes for storage of the artwork. And racks, rolling racks to put the paintings on and so forth. And hydrothermographs, very important little instruments that tell you exactly about the humidity, which was one of our terrible enemies. So this is the ribbon cutting, and some of you might see yourselves, for the opening of the Hand Art Center. And ta-da! We had a space, we had a dedicated gallery for the Bluemner, we had a place where they were safely stored, and now we needed to put some things on those walls in that special dedicated gallery. So for the first year of operation in the Hand Center, the first two exhibitions were really a kind of pared down reprise of what we had done 5 years before in the Duncan Gallery. The first half, The Making of American Modernist Painter, was the first half of Bluemner's career. Again, we had a couple of lecture series bringing in people who had been experts on Bluemner and who could assess related issues. And then for the second half of the year, we had the second half of Bluemner's career. Again, really reprising things from the earlier exhibition. Part of the trick was that we had things that we had already framed up, but two convenient things that we figured out. It was nice that Bluemner tended to work in fairly standard sizes. And therefore and because the majority of the works were works on paper, we figured out that we didn't have to buy 1,000 frames and figure out where to put 1,000 framed pieces, but that we could mat things up to these standard sizes, have a set of standard sized frames, and we could change out the works in and out of the frames as the exhibitions occurred. So then we had another lecture series and brought in, actually one of the people that was particularly interesting was the conservator from the Wadsworth Athenaeum, who had written the article on Bluemner's techniques for the Whitney catalog. And then Jeffrey Hayes came back again to talk. Dr. Susanna Eulis talked about Bluemner and Germany, and that was also a nice aspect. We also began to be involved in other kinds of loans. One of the things that Bluemner's the legacy included was a lot of archival material. So when they were putting the Montclair Art Museum and the Baltimore Art Museum were putting on a big exhibition on Cézanne and American modernism that would include works by Bluemner, they were particularly interested in the fact that we had an important book on Cézanne, early book on Cézanne with all of Bluemner's notations on it, and little brochures from some of the very earliest Cézanne exhibitions in America with Bluemner's notes on it. And those were included in the Cézanne and American Modernism exhibit. Then 2010, the first exhibition that I put together was kind of a surprising one, since Bluemner was mostly known for his color, because it was one of a lot of very small works on black and white. They were all together in a folder when I went through the Bluemner's Vera's collection, but really exquisite, very poetic, small works. I called this one the Vermillionaire in black and white, and that was our first exhibit of the year. And then in the spring, I just decided we needed something more colorful, and I made a whole exhibition based, kind of moving out from the idea of the Jersey Silk Mills article that I'd written, but including all the works that represented the city of Paterson. This began a theme that I called Oscar Bluemner's America, because Bluemner was very interested in representing his particular side of America. And in fact, this exhibition came to the attention of the Montclair Art Museum that was planning for 1913 a big exhibition commemorating that armory show that I mentioned a while ago, and another exhibition. And they thought that this would make a nice parallel with that, because 2013 would be the centennial also of the Paterson Silk Strike that was such an important cultural event of the time. So this exhibit that was at Stetson went up to New Jersey for that exhibition. And then another thing that we were very interested in conserving were some charcoal drawings. These were all tucked in a big fat portfolio stuffed under the sofa in Vera Bluemner's house when Gary and I went over there to collect the works. A lot of them were on thin architecture paper, and you can see the one up here. They were all often folded and wrinkled, and some of them were folded in thirds. And we had Walter Newman look at them when he came to assess the collection. And we said, is there any way that these could ever be fixed so that they could be exhibited, because they were really quite wonderful. And he said, oh yeah, we could do that. So we managed to get another grant from the IMLS to do that, and sent these works up to Massachusetts to have them flattened out, steamed out, patched up, so that we could have this next exhibit. At about this same time, the interest in Bluemner was hotter and hotter, and the price tags of things that were being sold at auction, one of those factors that Katja loves and that always does get people's attention, was happening. And this piece, for instance, one of the early oil paintings that Bluemner had done in the 1915 was auctioned off at Christie's. The estimate was that it was going to go for $2 to $3 million. It actually eventually ended up selling for $5,345,500, which, as you will, if you've been paying attention to the math, that price of that oil painting alone was more than twice the valuation, the original valuation of Vera's bequest to Stetson. So that got a lot of people's attention. But meanwhile, back at Stetson, we were continuing to to work on ideas of new exhibitions. The wonderful thing about Bluemner is he was so varied in his approach and in his subjects that you could keep finding new ways to look at his art, new questions to ask, new stories to tell, because that's what an exhibit really does, is to tell one kind of a story. After all that black and white stuff, I thought we needed some color again. And there were a lot of really wonderful watercolors that had not been included in any of the exhibitions so far that I thought really needed to come out. And I realized that a lot of them belong to a series that Bluemner did in the 20s when he was really desperately poor, but he decided he just had to get back to making art again. And he decided he was going to do 100 watercolors, very precisely done on a certain size sheet of paper, etc. Some of them were still of these New Jersey subjects that had been quite typical of some of his early work. Some of them were scenes from New England, where he was increasingly visiting his son up near Boston, and where he eventually moved in 1926. So I call this exhibit Concentrated Color. And then in the following year, in the fall, we had what was actually the most elaborate exhibition that we had in the Hand Center, because we used not only the dedicated Bluemner gallery, but the other big gallery for the exhibition. It took up 2 whole galleries, and it consisted entirely of scenes that Bluemner had painted that represented one of his favorite subjects. Across the northern part of New Jersey, there was an old canal that was very important in the pre-railroad years called the Morris Canal. It's not there anymore. There's an interstate highway that's basically run over it in the past. But in the early years when Bluemner was living in New York, his daughter told me he used to take the family out for walks in the countryside, and they'd often go along the canal path and spend the night at farmhouses and wander around, and he would make drawings. And he represented lots and lots of different scenes of that subject. So this was the 2-part exhibit that filled the 2 galleries, including works from quite early on, and then works that went all the way up to his final exhibition in 1935. That spring, Dr. Eulis came up with a quite different kind of approach to Bluemner, going back to, remember, Bluemner was German and then American, so we had Bluemner's America in the canals. Now we go back to Bluemner's Germany. She actually went and visited Germany and went to one of the places that we had lots of pictures of by Bluemner done, both when he was quite young, before he came to the United States, and when he went back to visit in 1912, the town of Jericho, where his grandparents lived. And she actually went and found the houses and a lot of the scenes that he had represented and took photographs of them, so that she had an exhibit that paralleled Bluemner's works with photographs of the current scenes by Bluemner. That was a great exhibit. And then going on to 1913, we could dig again into that collection, that wonderful collection of 167 color sketches. These were done with these special architect's colors that Bluemner discovered, and found that they were really wonderful for giving the kind of vivid color that he wanted to in his pictures. And moving along into the spring of that year, I had noticed a big banner across the campus the year before saying, what was it? Stetson was designated as a tree campus USA. And I thought, well, that's very appropriate for Bluemner, because he was always fascinated with trees. It's one of his big motifs. His drawings are filled with them. Often he, has parallels between the tree shapes and dancers and human figures of various kinds. So I devoted this exhibition to Oscar Bluemner's language of trees. And then in the following fall, we turned to another aspect of Oscar Bluemner's America, the scenes that featured scenes from New England, ones that he had painted when he went to visit New England and when he eventually moved there in 1926 after his wife's death. And then moving back across the Atlantic, as he had gone back and forth, in 2015, Oscar Bluemner's Europe, scenes from France, from Paris, down to the Mediterranean, including a series of big black and white drawings that were kind of intriguing because they had never been turned in. They were the kind of drawings that he made usually as preliminary to big color paintings, but he never made those paintings. It seems to be a project that he abandoned, but he made some very wonderful drawings, which we own all of. And then another conservation project was undertaken. We managed to get another grant from the Stockman Family Foundation to do some conservation works on another aspect of Bluemner's collection, or Viracuba's collection. this was not works by Bluemner himself, but the Japanese woodblock prints that he had collected, and which were a very important source of inspiration for him, as indeed they had been for whole generations of Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, and Modernist paintings in Europe and in America. And so we've sent these up to the Northeast Document Center, and they were cleaned and prepared for matting and framing. And in the next season, we put on an exhibition that I called Oscar Bluemner and the Orient, in which we had on one side of the gallery the Japanese prints, and on the other side of the gallery, Bluemner's own works that were inspired by, this is the Bluemner and this is the Japanese print, in case you hadn't guessed, that were inspired by these works. Terry also did a wonderful performance. I forget, was it in that year or was it back in the Duncan Gallery days? Anyway, you did a wonderful, wonderful presentation with some of her poetry that relates to themes from Japan. And when we had our lecture series, Katja gave us a wonderful presentation on Orientalist fashion. So we had, we had some other aspects of Oscar Bluemner and Adeline Julia, now Guy, came back. Then the next exhibition that I came up with in 2016 was, again, Oscar Bluemner's Germany, back onto the other side of the Atlantic, to show works that had mostly never been seen or never been exhibited, well, except with the exception of a lot of watercolors that Bluemner had actually done for what was his very first solo exhibition in his whole life. It was his what would have been his high school graduation exhibition, the little watercolors that he did and exhibited in his town of Elberfeld. So we had, I called it Youth in Return, because we had those exhibits, for those wonderful little watercolors from back in the 1880s, 1890s. And then we had works that he had done when he came back to visit Germany in 1912. And then also in 2016, we put together a loan exhibition for the Vero Beach Museum of Art. That was held there. Really wonderful facility down in South Florida. And then having talked about it, having devoted an exhibition to the trees, I thought it was very important, particularly since Bluemner was an architect, to devote an exhibition to the architecture, to the buildings. So in the fall of 2016, we had the exhibition, The Language of Architecture, which included everything from drawings that he'd done when he was an architecture student in Germany to actual, architectural studies from his career in America of architecture, but then a whole range of different representations of buildings throughout his career. 2017 was a very important year because this was the year of Bluemner's sesquicentennial, 150 years from his first birthday. And do I have that figure right? Anyway, so this was going to be the birthday year, and we thought we should make a lot of hoopla about it. So the first exhibition was one of works called Becoming a Painter, because these were works that were done in the period before Bluemner had decided to finally become a painter and abandoned his architectural career. But while he was already in America, a lot of these works had never been shown before, and there turned out to be some rather wonderful ones in the collection. And then for the first time, we held in 2017 a summer show, because since Bluemner's birthday was on June the 21st, we thought that it would be a shame not to have something going on for his birthday. And we thought that it was appropriate to have a birthday party. So actually and Chris, I'm blanking a moment, the student who did this wonderful painting, which is now part of the Stetson collection of Oscar Bluemner, based on a photograph, and which was then transferred to the birthday cake that we had for Oscar Bluemner, when we had wine and cake and celebration. I just put together for the first time an exhibit that was a lot of small, wonderful small works that didn't fit into any other narrative and pattern. It was like a choose your own adventure, make up your own story to go with these works. And then the final exhibition that I curated, actually I put down my gavel or whatever it was in 2017, but was one that went back to something that had very much fascinated me. When I had seen this watercolor of the Jersey silk mills, and I was rummaging through the still partially cataloged or uncatalogued works by Bluemner, I discovered this color pencil drawing, which I suddenly had one of those light bulb moments and thought, oh, that was the same motif. And the interesting thing is this watercolor relates to an oil painting that he did in 1916, 1917. He typically would make a half-size watercolor, full-size oil painting, one of those big black and white studies, and maybe have several things. But when he went to Germany, he had taken his first set of oil paintings. They were pretty much in this kind of a style, the style of the color pencil drawings. But after his show at Stieglitz's Gallery, he wasn't selling the work. The money that he'd made on his courthouse lawsuit had run out, but he still desperately wanted to make new paintings. And he was really dissatisfied with these earlier works because he just had, totally revised his style and his ideas while he was in Germany. So he literally scraped down the early paintings and repainted them in this new modernist style. So when you have the early color pencil drawings, it's almost like you have X-ray vision. You can get an idea of what those works looked like before he scraped down and redid them, kind of the before Europe and the after Europe effect. And I found out we actually had a number of works that related to the various process that he went through on the paintings that he was doing then in the teens. So we put together a show where the works from Stetson, an early color pencil drawing, two of the big black and whites that he called notans, were displayed alongside reproductions of other works in other collections that continued the process to the final oil painting. And that was the last of those exhibitions that I put together. And after that, let's see, here I am again. That was it. So whirlwind tour, and I'm afraid it wasn't as whirlwind as I could, but I hope I've left time for you all to bring in your own questions. And if I can tell you more things, let me know.
Absolutely, Roberta. Thank you so much. Applaudissements. Okay, quick note to students, the cultural credit forms are open now, so don't forget to put your information. And now let's open it for discussion. I know that there are students here who have curatorial ambitions, so that would be a perfect resource for you guys. So who wants to ask a question?
I have a quick question.
Okay.
So when Vera donated the Bluemner collection to Stetson, did the university have any kind of collections policy addressing the accession of artworks at that time?
No. Did we have any kind of policy about anything addressing artworks? No. So did we have any kind of system for doing all of this stuff? No. Did we have anybody who was had gotten an education in museum studies and even knew how a catalog works? No. We made it up from scratch. And a lot of what I learned, one of my biggest resources in figuring out a lot of this stuff were my former students. I had a few students, in fact, I had one student who is now, I think she's now chief curator, or maybe she's even the director at the museum up in Jacksonville, who was then registrar at the Daytona Museum. I kept sending students over to do interns with her so they could learn how to catalog artworks, so they could then help me catalog all the works. And she helped us to come up with our system of numbering and things like that. And whenever I ran into, okay, how do we loan works? I would borrow forms and things like that. So, and as to the accessioning, no, it had been slapdash. One of the good things is that once we got a system for cataloging the Bluemner works, we began to kind of try to both catalog and to some degree de-accessioning things that Stetson had acquired higgledy-piggledy, pell-mell, by guess and by gosh, or however kind of way. So one summer I had a student who was working on the Bluemner cataloging. She had some extra time, had her catalog all the ceramic collection that Dan Gunderson had accumulated through the years. Of course, we had to find out, how do you put numbers on ceramics? All those little things you have to discover.
Clay, you had a question. Mhm.
Okay, well, my question now. I was just wondering, with the black and white, I guess, paintings that you had done, did he mean to put those in color, or was there some kind of intent or reason?
No, I mean, actually, I skimmed past it all, but the black and whites were usually done as part of the process. He was incredibly methodical about the way he did his artworks, especially those early works. I flashed through it at the end. You saw where there was a color pencil drawing and a couple of black and white studies. For his major works at that time, he would always make one of these black and white studies. He wanted to work out the value relationships before doing the color piece. And he called those notan, N-O-T-A-N, which is an Oriental term, which he took from one of the people he had learned from. And that was for him a very, very important step. And he would work, he was totally obsessive about all kinds of details in the production. One thing I didn't mention, and one of the invaluable resources for his studies, is the fact that he kept a painter's diary and also incredible collections of notes and things. And he gave those to the guy who was the director of the WPA project up in Boston, who eventually gave them to the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C., which is part of the Smithsonian. And in the last about 10, maybe no more than that, maybe 15 years ago, when I was first working on Bluemner, you could access those either by microfilm or by going up to Washington sometimes and rummaging through them in the stacks. But now they're all digitized, and there's a wonderful, so you can actually access the papers, and that's an invaluable resource, because he didn't, you can find out when something was made. He often had little drawings of the things, and he also took all these notes about all the stages of production, technical notes, philosophical notes, theoretical notes, acknowledgement of his sources and things like that. But those big black and whites are very much part of a process. He wouldn't necessarily have thought of those as the end product. And they're not paintings, they're typically done in charcoal, but then fixed with some kind of a fixative. Anybody else?
I muted myself.
I wanted to ask about the state of the collection when you found it. Were those portfolios chronological or by type? There's by size, but I guess. What was it? What exactly was it like?
Well, and some things were, there were various little, like that big portfolio that had the black and whites in them. I mean, those were, they were the size and the kind of thing that fit into that portfolio, but they tended to be a group of things that were kind of related. Those little black and white studies that were in that first exhibition, actually, the reason I had wanted to show those is that when first Vera had expressed her interest in leaving the stuff to Stetson, I thought that, I could get a grant for the summer and I could catalog everything. I didn't realize, I had no idea how much stuff there was and how complicated that would be. But so I was also was very eager to get, to interview her and to get some records of what she remembered about her father, about all the people that he knew, like Stieglitz and John Marin and you name it. And so at one point I went over and she had a manila envelope that had all those little black and whites in it. I said, okay, I'll take these back over to Stetson and I'll catalog them and try to gets, and they were kind of related. Most of those were related, kind of, they fit together chronologically. Another time when I went over to visit with Vera, she pulled out an envelope from one of her desk drawers that had those 167 color pencil sketches. And those came from a fairly, tight chronological time. And the nice thing, those particular ones were, not only were they almost all labeled as to date, but also to site and what time of day he painted them, and sometimes even what the weather was like. So that was, but other things were, in various kinds of things. There were some of the works that we had in that first exhibition were the things that she'd had hanging on the wall. She'd had them framed up, some of them in these god awful, like green malachite frames and stuff like that. So things were sometimes in groups. When Christie's came to do the appraisal, as I say, we spread them out on all these tables, and they fell into some sorts of groups. I mean, there were piles of things that were kind of totally unrelated. There were a whole lot of small drawings that this dealer who had been trying to get her to sell stuff to him, and he kept coming by. He had taken those off to wherever his gallery was, and out of the whatever context they had been in when Vera had them, they were all in like an accordion file. Chris remembers those, the famous accordion file. And actually the lawyer, he claimed that he took them because he was going to give them to the Archives of American Art, which was, I think, a big, that was not his intent. But he had rearranged them, but because most of them did have dates written on them, and he'd rearranged them by date, but who knows how they had originally been left. Now, the colored pencil drawings, for instance, Bluemner had put them in that envelope, and he'd marked that very valuable, save, so that they were they were the ones that he really wanted to keep. He felt they were very important because they were not only, he thought were, important and well done in and of themselves, but they were also like his resource. They were the things that he went back to for his ideas, but he kept going back to those same subjects. So they were important from that respect. And some of the things, I think a lot of those little black and whites too, often he even had prices marked on them and things like that. So, and he had a little system of annotating things with red that were things that he considered particularly valuable. So his ordering of things, for instance, giving the stuff to Hatch, the guy that eventually gave him to the archives, was very much with a mind to posterity. He never had much financial or hardly any financial success in his lifetime, but he was convinced that people would eventually recognize what he'd done, and we've tried to do that.
Okay, so as our conversation is coming to close, could you give an advice to future Bluemner curators?
Future Bluemner curators. Well, there's still plenty, there's so many possibilities with that collection. The thing that I loved about it is that I thought it was such a wonderful teaching collection, because if we're in a place where would-be artists or would-be poets are being educated, to look at the complexity of what Bluemner put into to making himself into an artist, which he literally kind of was self-made in that respect, and the complexity of his thought, that his rendering of all these different the steps in the process, his very thoughtful comments about the theoretical aspects of his art, and just his observation. I mean, the fact that he never traveled anywhere without his little sketchbook and was constantly taking notes, making drawings, and so forth and so on. When he went to Europe, he came back with, he would spend hours and hours and hours in the museum and fill a whole notebook in a day with notes on every single thing that he saw. And I think those kinds of resources are incredibly valuable for everybody, whether it's art that you're making or even physics experiments.
I want to finish actually with Terry's, well, there is something with the sun, with Terry's note, which I think is amazing. Roberta, thanks so much for the long and precious work you did with this amazing collection, forever in your debt. And I think we can all agree with that. Thank you again, Roberta. Applaudissements.
Well, thank you.
Okay, guys, thank you so much for coming. Bye.